How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 6th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the first half of the 3rd section of Ferdinand de Saussure's course in General Linguistics, titled Synchronic Linguistics. Last time, we looked at the nature of a sign and examined a few of the differences between synchrony and diachrony. Since the chapter we're going to be looking at today is so large, I've decided to split it into 2 parts. The second one should be up not long after this episode is published. I'm going to be doing the same with the following section, Diachronic Linguistics, which is 8 chapters long just like this one. Today, we'll go through the first 4. Firstly, generalities, then the concrete entities of language, then identities, realities, and values, and finally, but not so leastly, linguistic value. To begin with, Saussure's main focus in generalities is to expand what exactly he meant by synchrony and language states. He starts off by saying that many of the elements which he discussed from the section on general principles, which we covered last episode, fall under synchrony, such as science and grammar, something that we will expand on throughout this part. Going onwards, static linguistics, a synonym for synchronic linguistics, is, in his eyes at any rate, more difficult to study in comparison to evolutionary or diachronic linguistics. This is because whilst diachronic linguistics often deals with concrete facts, like the etymology of words from different areas compared up against each other, there is almost a web of complicated relationships between signs that make up language states. This web is so nebulous and interconnected that it makes it seem almost impenetrable. In terms of language states themselves, Saussure points out that defining them as languages at certain points in time, like he originally did, doesn't really work all that well. This is because language is fluid, it's always changing. Instead, he says, we have to consider them as spans of time, where whatever changes occur are only minor or inconsequential. These spans can vary quite massively on how much time they last, from years to centuries. To give an example not mentioned by him, take Icelandic versus English. Icelandic, due to how isolated it is and the power of the regulatory bodies that intervene in its evolution, has remained in the same language state for a long time. English, on the other hand, has changed massively, a myriad of words dropping out of use and a multiplicity more being coined. These two may coexist, but whilst Icelandic can be studied synchronically, English across the same period would have to be studied diachronically, in other words, through time. This concludes the rather short first chapter and takes us to the next, simply titled The Concrete Elements of Language. A bit longer than the first, this chapter is composed of 4 different subsections. He begins with definition, entity, and unit. He underlines again that signs are not abstractions, but rather real, concrete objects of linguistic study. If you need a little refresher, here's him talking about them in the introduction.
Linguistic signs, though basically psychological, are not abstractions. Associations which bear the stamp of collective approval, and which added together constitute language, are realities that have a seat in the brain.
Saussure goes on to look at the 2 important features of signs. First, he discusses how signs exist only through the association of a signifier, the sound image, and a signified, the concept brought to mind by the signifier. The one can't exist without the other in his view, as they are entirely interdependent. At the very least, the sign only becomes linguistic when both are together. As an example, take the syllables pom, ma, gran, and it. They can be described as signifiers, sure, since they are sounds that impact our senses. But they aren't linguistic. Only together, connected with their signified, the fruit, do they become studyable. Otherwise, they are simply the concern of those who study phonation itself. Likewise, a signified without a signifier isn't a linguistic sign, but rather nothing more than psychological. It can't be expressed in any way. This is why it's so important not to confuse a part of a sign for its totality. Secondly, he says,
the linguistic entity is not accurately defined until it's delimited, i.e. separated from everything that surrounds it on the phonic chain. These delimited entities or units stand in opposition to each other in the mechanism of language.
Essentially, as we went over in the last video, sounds or signifiers are released in a linear fashion. In other words, they're released as a straight line through time, or chain as Saussure describes it as. In order to cut up the chain in any meaningful way, we have to apply meaning, or signifieds. By doing that, we are able to differentiate each sign from the other. Ending definition, entity and unit, we find ourselves with method of delimitation, the next subchapter. As the name suggests, this section is about how we are able to separate out signs from a chain. He uses this diagram to represent it. The line A refers to concepts or signifieds, whilst line B refers to signifiers, the phonetic element of a chain. The only way the lines make any sense, or at least line B, is when it is paired with the other. To give an example, take the sentence, I want pomegranates. As a phonetic chain, unconnected to meaning, it could theoretically be broken up in any such way, such as Iwa, Intpo, Magra, Nat. This reads like gibberish. We know it's wrong because we're able to apply line A to line B. In other words, concepts to sounds. Iwa doesn't mean anything in English, but I want does. Moving swiftly along, we're now onto the penultimate section of the chapter, practical difficulties of delimitation. It's here that we run into a problem. What exactly makes up the unit of language to be delimited? Is it a word, like we were discussing earlier? Well, no. Very quickly, we run into a dilemma. Different words can have different forms whilst meaning the same thing. What I mean is, words like horses and horse. They are clearly related, but they are different words, as they cut up different parts of line B. It could maybe be sentences, since that's what we speak in, but even then, does the sentence belong to language or to speaking, which, as we demonstrated in the first few episodes, are separate? These are questions Saussure seeks to answer, although he'll only do so in chapter 5, so we'll return to these ideas next video. For now, we can move on to the final subchapter, conclusions. Here, he begins by pointing out that in most sciences, the question of units never poses a problem. A zoologist, for example, has their animals, whilst an astronomer has their stars. In his opinion, most sciences that don't deal with their units don't need any. History doesn't need any specific units, be them individuals, eras, or nations. However, language is complicated because it's a system based off of the opposition of its parts. Concluding the chapter, Saussure says this.
Language has the strange, striking characteristic of not having entities that are perceptible at the outset, and yet not permitting us to doubt that they exist, and that their functioning constitutes it.
This takes us to chapter 3, called Identities, Realities, Values. He begins by emphasizing just how important the question of units is to static linguistics, stating that any basic notion in it depends on and even blends into units. His way of showing this depends on outlining three things: synchronic identities, realities, and values, hence the title. He starts out by separating out diachronic and synchronic identity. Diachronic identity is the link between a word and its ancestor, and vice versa, like the French negation pas and the Latin passum. Synchronic identity, on the other hand, is what allows us to say the sentences I don't like apples and don't do that contain the same element. On first glance, we may be tempted to define identity as simply shared slices of sound that contain the same meaning. However, Saussure remarks that this is a bit too simple. Identity can exist without that correspondence. For example, when a lecturer uses the word gentleman multiple times in a lecture with different inflections, different implied meanings, identity existing all the while. So, what is it then? This is an important question since, as Saussure states,
the linguistic mechanism is geared to differences and identities, the former being only the counterpart of the latter. Everywhere, then, the problem of identities appears.
To explain identity, he offers a couple of examples. My favorite is of the identity of the 8:25 p.m. train from Geneva to Paris on 2 different days. We feel that it's the same train each day, even though likely all the staff and even the vehicle itself is different. Likewise, when a road is demolished and later rebuilt, for example through roadwork, we still say that it's the same road, even if all the parts have been replaced. The reason why is that identity isn't fully material, it's also based on the elements outside of what makes it up. The road gets the identity by its relationship to other roads around it, the train by a specific route, time of departure, and everything else that sets it apart from other vehicles. However, this isn't to say that they are abstract, since we can only think of a train or the road through the material things that make them up. He ends the section by saying this.
Identity depends neither on material identity nor on sameness in meaning, but on elements which must be sought after and which will point up the true nature of linguistic units.
This takes us to the second part of the chapter, synchronic reality. The main point here is to demonstrate that concrete elements of language aren't directly accessible. He demonstrates this with the example of separating words into categories like adjectives and nouns and so on. Take the French sentence, Ces gants sont bon marché. These gloves are cheap. This question is if bon marché, meaning cheap here, is an adjective. It seems so from a logical point of view, but not from a grammatical one. It describes the noun gloves, but it doesn't change depending on gender or number. It doesn't even precede its object, and it is composed of two words. The result is that the division of words into parts of speech isn't truly an absolute linguistic reality. It's arbitrary to a degree. In Saussure's eyes, we have to do away with these illusions. We can then create classifications to organize those facts, but they must be based on concrete entities. Otherwise, we just lose sight of the fact that there is no linguistic fact apart from phonetic substance cut into signifying elements. Now, this takes us to the last section of the chapter. Here, Saussure shows that many of the ideas that he touched on in the rest of the chapter connect and blur into the idea of value. He uses another chess-based metaphor to prove his point, connecting it to synchronic identity in particular.
Take a knight, for instance. By itself, is it an element of the game? Certainly not, for by its material makeup, it means nothing to the player.
It only gains meaning when tied to value. By itself, it can be replaced by anything, even with a piece that looks nothing like it, such as a pebble. It only means something in relationship to other pieces, by the value imbued in it by the rules of a game. The same thing occurs in semiological systems, like language, where the notion of identity blends with that of the value set in place by the fixed rules of the system and vice versa. It's for this reason, says Saussure, that the notion of value envelops units, entities, and reality. He ends the chapter by stating that in order to get to the heart of static or synchronic linguistics, we have to start the investigation of units through the use of value. This segues us into the final chapter we'll be looking at today, fittingly titled Linguistic Value. It's split into 4 sections, the first of which being language as organized thought coupled with sound. Here, he sets out to prove that language is purely a system of values through examining the two sides of ideas and sounds. He starts out by describing how thought is a nebulous and shapeless mass, something that can only be organized through signs. In a description that connects quite closely to the structuralist psychoanalysis of Jacques Lacan, he says,
Without language, thought is a vague, uncharted nebula. There are no pre-existing ideas, and nothing is distinct before the appearance of language.
Similarly, sound is no more pre-delimited than thought. There are almost infinite different sounds and collections of sounds that humans can make. If you know anything about the Danish linguist Louis Hjelmslev, who we'll be discussing later on, he is talking about what the latter calls purport. Looking back to Saussure, he gives this diagram to show how the language can be envisioned in its totality. Essentially, language to him is a series of connecting subdivisions of two planes, the jumbled mass of thought and the vague mass of sound, additionally acting as a link between thought and sound instead of just serving to articulate the former. A metaphor he uses to explain it is that language is like a piece of paper with two sides, the two planes. They can't be separated lest you end up with pure psychology or pure phonology. This also adds to the arbitrary nature of science, since it shows that the two domains that make them up are both shapeless and connected in an arbitrary fashion themselves. Values are entirely relative. This connects to the fact that language is purely a social phenomenon, since if values are relative, it can only be through collective use that they become fixed in a system. Saussure ends the section by turning towards words as units. This might seem a bit odd, since he only recently looked over why words can't be units of language. But there's a method to Saussure's madness. Essentially, since the actual units are essentially impossible to access, words act as a rough but concrete stand-in. He promises that everything he discusses in terms of words will be just as applicable to units themselves. This takes us to the next subchapter, Linguistic Value from a Conceptual Viewpoint. Here, he is seeking to separate out value from signification. From a conceptual point of view, he says, value is a part of signification. This raises a problem though, since it's difficult to see how signification can be both dependent on, yet still be distinct. He offers this diagram to turn back to what exactly signification, or the signified, is. As it shows, signification is the counterpart of the sound image or signifier. When the word is looked back as independent and self-contained, all that is concerned is the signifier and the signified. However, this leads to something of a paradox.
On the one hand, the concept seems to be the counterpart of the sound image, and on the other hand, the sign itself is in turn the counterpart of the other signs of language.
He provides now yet another diagram. Language, Saussure states, is a system of interdependent terms in which the value of each results from their relations to each other. To clear up any confusion between values, ruled by these horizontal arrows, and signification, ruled by the vertical lines of a sign, he says that value is composed of two categories of things, the one dissimilar and the other similar. A dissimilar thing is something that can be exchanged for what the value is to be determined for, whilst the similar things are what can be compared with it. To explain this, he offers the example of 5 francs. To figure out its value, we need first to figure out what it can be exchanged for, such as a loaf of bread, or what it can be compared to, like to a 1 franc coin or to a dollar or rand. Similarly, a word can be exchanged for something dissimilar, an idea, and can be compared with something similar, different words. It isn't enough to say that a word's value is fixed because it can be exchanged with an idea, but instead you also have to say that it's fixed by its relationship with other signs around it. Summing this up, Saussure says,
Being part of a system, it is endowed not only with a signification, but also and especially with a value, and this is something quite different.
The most precise feature of signs is that they are separate from those around them. Now, at the end of a section, Saussure offers another diagram, this time of the French word juger, to judge. It symbolizes signification, he says, but initially it's nothing. It's only through its value and its relationship with other values that it means anything. This takes us to the penultimate subchapter, linguistic value from a material standpoint. Much like the conceptual side, the material side of value is made up solely of relations and differences with other terms in the language. It isn't sound alone, rather the differences that make it possible to separate out that sound from the others around it. Additionally, sound itself doesn't belong to language. It's only what Saussure calls a secondary thing, substance put to use. To illustrate this, he goes back to the example of the 5 francs. A coin worth that much might contain half that amount in silver, but it's not the metal that gives it the value, but rather what's stamped onto it. Similarly, linguistic signifiers aren't composed of the material itself, the sound, but from the differences between that material and that of other signifiers. He finishes the section by looking at how the same thing is mirrored in writing, another system of signs. He lists 4 things. Firstly, signs in writing are arbitrary. The letter T is not naturally or intrinsically connected to the sound we associate with it. Secondly, its value is not really dependent on it itself. You can write your T any way, as long as it remains distinct from other letters like L and J. Thirdly, closely related to the last characteristic, the letter requires a closed system of other letters to allow for those differences to define it, similarly to how languages have restricted phonetic inventories. Lastly, it doesn't really matter how the letter is produced, for example, whether it's printed in black and white or made with a pen or pencil. There's no effect on its signification. This takes us to the final section of the chapter, and thus to the end of the video, titled The Sign in its Totality. He starts off by stating that
everything that has been said up to this point boils down to this. In language, there are only differences.
Additionally, this difference isn't positive, it's negative. What that means is that rather than being contingent on the identities themselves, signifiers and signifieds can only be differentiated from the outside by those around them. However, this all changes when we talk about signs as wholes. We can't speak of difference, but rather distinction. This is an idea that he builds on more for remaining chapters of the section. But for now, this concludes the first half of Synchronic Linguistics from Ferdinand de Saussure's course in General Linguistics. I truly hope that you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll look at the rest of the section on synchrony and explore more about the relationships between signs. Until then, bye!